This whiteboard lecture is going to cover part 1 of chapter 4, and what I'm going to do is review and expand upon what we learned in chapter 3 regarding the market system. So if we go back to chapter 2, we learned that society as a whole has a production possibility curve, and you'll recall that it looked something like this. And we said that, let's say, we can either allocate resources to produce good X, or we can allocate goods to produce good Y. And so any point along this production possibility curve represents as a different allocation of resources. And every time we want to produce more of Y, that means we have to give up more of X. Every time we want to produce more of X, we have to give up more of Y. Well, in a market system, how does a society choose which point they're going to produce at? In other words, how do we know whether we want to produce more of good X or more of good Y? Well, in chapter 3, we learned that it's based on the supply and demand conditions in the market, right? In other words, we have a supply of a particular good or service, we have demand for particular goods and services, and as long as that supply and demand reflects positive prices where firms can make money, then that good is going to be produced. So it's the supply and the demand within the market system that dictate which goods and services are going to be produced. Now, to be a little bit more specific in terms of which goods and services are actually going to be produced within society, although it is supply and demand that dictate the quantities and the prices that we pay, it's the actual consumer, in other words, the demand in the market, that has the most power. It is consumers who basically dictate which goods and services are going to actually be produced by the firms. And the way that we dictate what is produced is simply through our purchases. The more we purchase something, the more the good is going to be produced. The less we purchase something, the less that good is going to be produced. So for example, you'll notice that I have the fast food industry listed here. In other words, it wasn't that restaurants just one day decided, I think that we would rather allocate resources to a fast food restaurant opposed to a sit-down restaurant. It was the change in consumer taste and preferences that drove the firms to actually supply fast food. So anytime that consumers alter what they purchase, firms respond to that change and alter the goods and services they produce in response to the change in demand. The word that we give this to explain the power that the consumers ultimately have is consumer sovereignty. The definition of consumer sovereignty is simply the authority of the consumers to determine what is produced through their purchases of goods and services. So I like to pose the question, can you think of any new products or industries in the market today that were created by consumer sovereignty? And again, I'm sure many things come to mind. Maybe you think of cell phones. Maybe you think of organics. Maybe you think of hybrid vehicles. In other words, these are products that have not always been on the market. However, they're there now simply because that is what the consumers are demanding. In other words, as consumers demand more of particular goods, firms are going to alter how they allocate their resources in order to produce those goods that the consumers want, because that's where they're going to be able to make their profits. And of course, if you think about anything that's on the market at this point, if it's being purchased by consumers, then that means it's there because of consumer sovereignty. Firms would not continue to produce a good if consumers weren't buying it, if we were not demanding it. If we were no longer demanding a good, then the firm wouldn't be able to make any money off of producing that good. So again, all products that are sold in the market are there because of consumer sovereignty. So what happens when we alter our demand to the point that we no longer prefer a particular good or service? Well, again, firms are not trying to produce a good that they want. They're trying to produce a good that consumers want because they are driven by profits. So again, you'll see right here at the top of this lecture slide, I basically state if a product has potential to make a profit, you can bet that someone will use their resources available to them to produce that product. So again, it's all about profits. Firms are driven by profits. They always want to maximize those profits. So once a firm realizes that consumers' taste and preferences have changed and they're no longer making those profit margins by producing a particular good, then they're going to start allocating those resources elsewhere to the particular products that consumers do want. So what we call this in a market economy is creative destruction. So the process of new products and new firms replacing existing products and firms is called creative destruction. And creative destruction is a good thing. In other words, when firms are no longer producing old products and producing new products, generally those products are better. In other words, we the consumer benefit through the process of creative destruction in a market economy, because the whole reason the creative destruction is occurring is because our taste and preferences have changed and the firms are now going to produce the new good or service that we now prefer more to the old good or service. So creative destruction in a market economy is desired by the consumer. So let's look at a specific example of the market, of the firms responding to a change in consumer preferences. Again, us displaying our consumer sovereignty in the market. So you'll notice on this slide, I have a graph that is illustrating the PDA market. And I'm not sure how many of you remember the PDA market or what a PDA is, but it's basically a personal data assistant. It came on the market separately from a cell phone. So I think the original Blackberries were considered PDAs, where people were able to use them as their data assistant most often for work. So you'll notice that we have our first graph here, graph A, that showed the initial market for the PDA. PDAs were very popular, so you had your supply and your demand for the PDAs, and that's what created the equilibrium price that was paid in the market. So according to this graph, in the PDA market, the firm was selling approximately 100 PDAs a week at a price of $80 per PDA. Now, let's say something changes in the market. Let's say consumer tastes change. In other words, we no longer prefer the PDA. We know that's going to be illustrated by a leftward shift of the demand curve. And again, we learned this in chapter 3. And so that's exactly what we see going on in our second graph here, the effect of a change in taste in the PDA market. And again, how does the firm know that there's been a change in consumer taste and preferences? Because of the surplus that's going to build up in their inventory. They're still charging this price over here of $80. However, they're not selling. Notice that based on the new demand curve, we're intersecting over here, which means the firm is having a surplus that looks like maybe it's around 60. So it's a surplus of about 40 building up in their inventories. Therefore, the firm knows that in order to eliminate the surplus, they need to lower the price until the quantity demanded equals the quantity supplied again, which of course is right here at E2. So at E2, we see that the firm is now going to be charging only $60 per PDA, selling 80 PDAs a week. And again, what happened over time? In other words, was this just a short-term change in the market, or was this a long-term change in consumer taste and preferences? Well, we know that it was a long-term change because consumers actually preferred a new and better product that had been introduced into the market. That new and better product that had been introduced into the market was the smartphone. In other words, somebody figured out, hey, rather than having a separate cell phone and a separate PDA, why don't we just combine the two so that somebody can have all of the benefits of a personal data assistant in the same mechanism as the cell phone. So again, we had the smartphone introduced into the market, which basically changed consumer taste and preferences. Again, you'll see graph A represents when the smartphone was initially introduced into the market, setting an equilibrium price of 500 and a quantity of 50 sold. But as that stayed in the market and consumers found that they really preferred this new smartphone, again, we saw the change in consumer preferences, which was reflected by a rightward shift of demand curve. So again, that's what we see going on here in the second graph. In other words, as our taste and preferences change and we started to prefer this smartphone, that drives the price up. So now in the short run, the equilibrium price of the smartphone was 600, and firms are now selling more. Instead of selling 50, they're now selling 60. And again, we know in the beginning, the way that the firm knows there's been a change in consumer taste and preferences to where they're preferring the smartphone is the opposite happens as to what we saw in the PDA market. They start to see a shortage in their inventories, therefore they have to raise the price in order to eliminate the shortage. So again, what probably happened over time, well, what we know happened over time, is this curve continued to shift out. In other words, demand continued to increase, but then of course, as other firms that produced PDAs in cell phones realized that that's where the demand was going, they too started to supply the phone. And so in the long run, the supply curve actually starts to shift out also. So in other words, the price doesn't keep going up and up and up. As the supply increases, that brings the price back down. So if we go back and look at the original graph for the PDA market, we know what basically happened over time is that this supply curve or this demand curve continued to shift down. In other words, our demand continued to decline as our taste and preferences moved towards this smartphone market, to the point that the price eventually gets so low that the firm can no longer make a profit off selling this product. So again, this is an example of that creative destruction. The company themselves did not just decide on their own that they were going to stop producing the PDA. It was the consumers that dictated to the firm that they were going to stop producing the PDA by simply decreasing our purchases of the PDA, and the firms responded to that. And again, those firms didn't go out of business. We know that they reallocated their resources to the production of the smartphone. And so that's where, again, our consumer demand continued to increase for this good, and firms responded to that. And so then you start to see over time the supply curve shifting out like so that the price isn't necessarily increasing. So again, just to recap, it is the consumer that maintains the power in the market. It is the demand side of the market that dictates what is going to be produced, because firms will produce goods and services and use the resources that enable them to generate the highest profit. And this phenomenon was actually first introduced back in 1776 when Adam Smith wrote the book Wealth of Nations, and he described it as the invisible hand. So if you are interested in, kind of researching the background behind the argument for the market system, I would recommend reading some literature on Adam Smith's theory of the invisible hand, and I've just kind of summarized it right here for you. Now, before I move on to the specifics of the market system in terms of the private and public sector, I just want to make sure that we understand where income comes from in the market system. In other words, if we, the consumer, are demanding these goods and services, where did we get the income in order to buy those goods and services? So again, it is the income and prices within the market system that determine who gets what, and we've already discussed that in Chapter 3. Those that have the most income get the most goods and services, which is why we don't consider it a completely fair allocation system. So the way that we obtain income is through selling our resources to the firm. So again, going back to Chapter 1, we talked about the fact that we obtain income by allowing the firms to use our land, labor, and capital. And the reason we allow them to use those resources is because they pay us for it. If you're an owner of land, you get rent. If you're an owner of labor, you get wages. And if you're an owner of physical capital, you receive interest. And then, of course, we know that another way to obtain income is through the profits that the firms use, but we'll talk about that in later chapters. But again, because of the fact that it is the owners of resources that provide the land, labor, and capital to the firms, we ultimately determine who gets the income in a market economy. So because of this, the sellers of the goods and services and the owners of the resources are linked in the economy. The sellers of the goods and services, that is simply the firms, and the owners of the resources, that is the households. And so again, that is what we will be talking about in the next part of the lecture. It is the firms and the households that basically make up what we call the private sector.